The Big Show.
All right, Greg, want to get to the running backs with you because it's thought to be a good class, might have a couple of first rounders this year. But before we do, there is some veteran news to get to, including, speaking of the draft, a guy in Derek Stingley who became by far the highest paid corner in NFL history. And this is important, I feel like, Greg, to talk about this time of year, because this is a guy that, refresh my memory, I think he had an incredible freshman year.
Then got
but
hurt.
Then either sophomore or junior, maybe he opted out with COVID, and then another year he got hurt. So he's had kind of I remember there being a lot of conversation about him when he came out in the draft a few years ago.
Yeah, and you nailed it, Ross. He had a great freshman year. Everybody saw the trades. Everybody said this guy's a big-time corner prospect, and then he really didn't play much after that. But he's a great corner. The interesting thing is he's not a matchup corner. He plays left corner. And now again, maybe they'll change things this year. Who knows? But he's been a left corner for the Texans. He is not a matchup corner. Because I always love when the schedule comes out and people start with, well, who's Derek, who's this corner going to match up with, who are the matchups? Well, he plays left corner, but he's a terrific player. I mean, he's got phenomenal ball skills, and he's obviously got great speed. He can run with vertical routes. He's just a great corner. I mean, you got to have corners in this league, and he's a great one.
Just curious your thoughts on matching versus keeping a guy on one side or the other. Because I've talked to a lot of people about this, and there's really pros and cons of both approaches.
Yeah, I don't have a brilliant answer for that. I mean, I think it probably has to do, too, with comfort level and technique. I mean, it's just like, offensive tackles when people assume, just take a right tackle, move him to left tackle, take a left tackle, move him to right tackle. My guess is the footwork's different. What you see is different. How you process it is different. Now, again, if you're just going to play a ton of man and you're saying to a corner, hey, you've got this cat and you're going to play a lot of press man, maybe it's different. But teams don't really do that. So, a lot of these corners in the NFL, even the really, really good ones like Stingley, and he's a top 3 corner in this league for sure, very often they just play on one side. And that's the way they play. And then you see that more often than corners traveling with receivers. It's more rare to see corners matching up with one receiver and traveling with him all around. It happens on occasion, but not as much as people might think.
I wanted to ask you, the big news late Sunday night that was talked about a lot yesterday was the Bengals getting it done. 4-year deals with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. Obviously, they're both tremendous players. We've talked about both at different times. I guess my question is, Greg, you watch a lot of tape. How important in your mind, how critical is it to have a really good number 2 receiver, to have that other guy that can really play?
I think it's absolutely critical because with the way defenses play now, with a lot more split safety, it becomes easier to bracket, double, whatever term you want to use, a number 1 receiver without, just within the context of your defensive structure. So now you can think of it this way. It is always possible to double two receivers if you want to. Obviously, that changes your whole defensive feel and how you do other things. But teams don't really do that. So they'll try to double one in specific situations, and you certainly see that with the big time receivers. You see it with Chase at times. You see it with Justin Jefferson. You see it with A.J. Brown at times. But if you have that number 2 receiver that's really, really good, and Higgins, my guess is, for a number of teams in the league, would be seen as a number 1, for some teams in the league for sure, then it just gets harder. It just gets harder to play on defense because it's the way you allocate your resources, so to speak, on defense, what you do with your linebackers, what you do on your back end. Do you want to pressure? Do you want to compromise numbers and coverage? It gets into so many different elements, Ross, as to how you want to play, because football's a numbers game. If you can rush 4 and be great, then you have 7 in coverage. If you feel like you have to rush 5, the numbers in coverage start decreasing, and that really impacts how you can play good receivers.
Speaking of good receivers, and speaking of having 2, we talked last week about Cooper Kupp. You voiced some concerns about, his explosiveness and just how much he had left. The Seahawks are bringing him up here, and they still have Smith and Jigba. And what I think is interesting here, and I got a question from a listener, Greg. Now, I don't remember if it was social media or if it was an email question, ross@rosstucker.com. But they said, can you ask Greg about the Seahawks now having 2 slot receivers?
Yeah, well, that's...
And Smith and Jigba and Kupp, and how that'll work?
I think that's the easy thing to say, Ross, and I think people who say that are not thinking that through. Don't you think the Seahawks know that? I mean, they're talking as if the Seahawks don't know that. They have a new offensive coordinator in Kubiak. They're going to line up. My guess is they're going to be very multiple with their formations. They're going to have a lot of reduced splits. There's going to be a lot of motion. They're not going to line up static and just say, oh, we have 2 slot receivers. We don't know what to do. Of course, they know all this. So they're going to have an offense that doesn't play in sort of an old-fashioned way where they just line up and there's a slot receiver and they go, oh, we got 2 of them. They're going to be very multiple. They're going to be reduced. They're going to have motion. They're going to do a lot of things. They obviously researched Kupp and they believe he's healthy, obviously, or they wouldn't assign him to a 3-year deal. And they're going to be really diverse in how they play. So to me, the easy answer for people who are not thinking it through is, oh, they got 2 slot receivers. That they know that. I mean, that's one of those things where, you got to think this through a little more.